welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez in Quito, and this is from the South. We begin with our top story in the Dominican Republic. The municipal elections have been suspended due to voting irregularities. The electoral authorities called off the elections due to the malfunctioning of the electronic voting system used in parts of the country. Manual voting has also been suspended. The president of the electoral body, Julio César Castaños, said several parties had denounced the irregularities that excluded thousands from voting.
Since last night, the electoral authority started installing the voting tables, and the automatic system already warned of inconsistencies, that each of the ballots in those voting centers had errors, and in half of the centers the tally was incomplete. And we tried all night to correct this mistake. And without a complete tally for all parties, we can't have an election.
And after the announcements, there were protests in several cities, including Santo Domingo Este and Villa Progreso. Citizens protested and burned tires in rejection to the decision. Political parties are demanding that all members of the electoral body resign. Now to Venezuela, more than 2 million military personnel from the Bolivarian Armed Forces were deployed for a civic military exercise. The Bolivarian Shield 2020 exercises were called by President Nicolás Maduro and seek to reinforce the civic military union throughout the country. These events will be taking place throughout the weekend to strengthen the territorial defense of Venezuela against any external threat and in defense of the country's sovereignty. Also in Venezuela, Communications Minister Jorge Rodriguez said the country's opposition is leading a corruption network that has seized more than $116 million from the country.
We are suing Trump's administration in the present times because of the accounting of the theft of our assets, of our deposits in foreign banks, of our companies that are in border cities, of all our income that could have been generated if there was no financial blockade, towards the imports that Venezuela needs, as they are doing at the moment. The companies that depend from the North American empire, which rises to $116 million. That is the accounted damage of the brutal act done by Trump's administration and the satellite governments and the Lakers that are here in Venezuela.
In other news, the Israeli Air Force has carried out airstrikes on the besieged Gaza Strip. Local media reports say fighter jets and helicopters on Sunday evening bombed several sites south of the city of Deir al-Balah city, causing damages to homes and public buildings. The Israeli military claimed that the raids were in response to the firing of 2 projectiles from the besieged enclave. No injuries have been reported so far. Meanwhile, Israeli security forces on Saturday attacked a group of Palestinians who attempted to remove a barrier that blocked access to their village in the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, Israeli soldiers put up barriers across several roads in towns and villages to the north and west of the city of Ramallah. Israel severely restricts Palestinians' freedom of movement through the use of approximately 100 fixed checkpoints, mobile checkpoints, cellular-only roads, and other physical obstructions. Chinese health authorities have continued to make progress against the COVID-19 outbreak. On Sunday, the National Health Commission announced a 10.5% reduction in the number of new confirmed cases in the city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak. The Commission said this is due to stronger prevention and control measures implemented by the government. The virus has infected more than 69,000 people and killed over 1,600 since it broke out in late December.
By midnight February 15, the severe cases in Wuhan, Hubei province, and nationwide have all seen a decline in terms of the proportion. In Wuhan, the peak, 32.4%, appeared on January 28th, and this proportion has been reduced to about 21.6% on February 15. In other cities, Hubei province, the peak, 18.4%, appeared on January 27th, and this percentage has dropped to 11.1%.
After this break, feminist organizations protest over the rising figures of femicides in Mexico. Join us for more in just a minute. Welcome back. More news at this hour. Social organizations in Colombia are calling for a de-escalation of tension between the government of Iván Duque and the largest remaining guerrilla group, the ELN. The call comes after the guerrilla group announced a 3-day armed strike, mainly in the northeast of the country.
The National Liberation Army guerrilla, ELN, has a presence in at least 5 regions of Colombia and a strong influence in the departments of Arauca, Chocó, and the north of Santander, areas in which there have been some acts of war, burning of vehicles and a public transport stoppage, after this organization announced a 3-day armed strike.
I think this strike is maybe the most important political act of the ELN in the last decade because it has had a huge impact and dimension. The President and Defense Minister have spoken about it. The people in the cities are worried. The strike that started on Friday morning and is going to go on until Sunday evening. About 30 vehicles have been burned in some regions of the country.
Terminación inmediata de todos los beneficios otorgados a ellos en el pasado por el Estado y la activación de las circulares rojas de la Interpol.
The government of Iván Duque declared the talks with the ELN to be broken after an attack on a police school in the capital in Bogotá in January of 2019, an event that entrenched the position of the executive that has always been against the peace talk.
Indeed, the politics of the government of Duque has no room for peace with the ELN or with other guerrillas movements. It will take political pressure by citizens to make him change his policies, including the inconsistency in applying the terms of the peace agreement with the FARC. But at the same time, President Duque never gave viability to the dialogue agenda that was built by the previous government.
Social organizations are demanding that stakeholders find ways for the restoration of the dialogue between the guerrillas and the government to protect civilians who are the most affected by the conflict.
Estamos soñando.
We are dreaming of seeing the end of the conflict, but we are not seeing it happening because there is a breakdown of dialogue between the government and the National Liberation Army. But we are really concerned by the decision of the armed strike of the ELN. As civil society, we see such as moving further away from the possibility of dialogue, and we are mainly concerned because we don't see political will from the government or the ELN.
At the moment, the ELN peace delegation is in Havana, Cuba, awaiting for direct dialogue with the government, which insists on imposing conditions, a strategy that, according to analysts, is unattainable.
And we continue in Latin America. Protesters in Chile have continued to take to the streets demanding social change despite heavy police repression. The protests that were initially sparked by an increase in the subway fares last October have turned into a broader movement demanding reforms to healthcare, education and the pension system. They also demand a change to the constitution, which dates back to the military dictatorship era. 31 people have died at the hands of security forces and more than 10,000 were arrested since the protests began.
People say, why you go there? Is that I come to breed humanity, to breed union, to breed hope that the 119 days we have been coming to this, we have been here 119 days, since we realize everything. And as you can see, we are not faltering.
Hundreds of human rights activists have demonstrated in Mexico against violence on women. The protesters gather in front of the presidential palace in Mexico City, calling on the government to investigate cases of gender violence. The activists also demanded a probe into the recent murder of a young woman in the capital. Meanwhile, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has assured that his government is concerned about violence against women and warned that perpetrators will be punished. Now to South Africa, where the ruling party, the African National Congress, has condemned claims by former President Frederick de Klerk that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. The ANC said de Klerk's conduct is an attempt to whitewash the brutal apartheid system. Last week, de Klerk claimed that the classification of apartheid as a crime against humanity by the United Nations in 1973 was part of an agenda by the Soviet Union and the ANC to stigmatize white South Africans. Relatives of the victims of Sudan's Darfur war have welcomed the decision by the transitional government to hand over former President Omar al-Bashir to face genocide and war crime charges. The family said the handing over of al-Bashir to the Hague-based court is a victory for the victims of the brutal war. Al-Bashir is facing 3 counts of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of war crimes perpetrated by government forces and allied militias during the Darfur war between 2003 and 2008.
The handing over of Bashir is a victory for the victims, a victory for all the Sudanese people, and a warning for any other person to not repeat the same actions.
Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has denied reports that he intends to resign. He said he will remain in office to serve the mandate that the Iranian people gave him.
My resignation does not make much sense. We have made promises to the people, and we will continue to fulfill those promises, despite the economic situation and pressure from the enemy. I would not even let the government leave its responsibility an hour earlier, not a month or a week earlier.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi says U.S. government officials are spreading lies against his country. Speaking on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, Yi said the U.S. has failed to accept the Asian giant's economic success.
The root cause of all these problems and issues is that the U.S. does not want to see the rapid development and rejuvenation of China, unless would they want to accept the success of a socialist country. That is not fair. China has the right to develop. The Chinese people have the right to live a better life.
Coming up, South Sudan's president announces a peace deal that could end the decades-old conflict. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you for joining us again. Tunisian Prime Minister Elias Fakhfakh on Saturday managed to form a new government after several failed attempts. But he immediately hit a major snag after members of the Ennahda party pulled out of the coalition. Fakhfakh was appointed 2 weeks ago and tasked by the president to form a government. Ennahda, which is Tunisia's biggest party, said it will only join the unity government if the party of defeated presidential candidate Nabil Karoui is allowed to join.
Despite our efforts, one of our main partners, I'm talking about Ennahda, decided this afternoon, an hour before the announcement, to withdraw from this government formation and not to give its vote of confidence at the parliament, because Tunis is not part of it. This places our country in a difficult position.
Burundi's main opposition party, the National Freedom Council, has nominated its leader, Agathon Rwasa, as its candidate for the upcoming general elections. Rwasa is a former rebel leader and will be facing ruling party candidate Evariste Ndayishimiye. Rwasa was chosen after the current leader, Pierre Nkurunziza, was forced by protests not to seek another term. Rwasa was the leading opposition candidate in 2 previous elections, but boycotted the 2010 and 2015 polls, saying there was too much repression of his supporters.
Let's go to the election. And if there are those who think they are more important than the others, we ask them to respect what the Burundians will have voted, because the path of a high-ranking officer in the army is equivalent to that of a minister, an unemployed person, a herder, or a farmer.
South Sudan's President Salva Kiir has announced a key peace plan set to end the country's 6-year conflict. President Kiir said the country was reverting to the former 10-state system, which was a major demand from the country's opposition and the main cause of the conflict. Opposition groups welcomed the move and are set to meet with the president to finalize the new deal. The country was originally made of 10 states, but the government later increased them to 32, a move which ignited fighting in Africa's youngest country.
This decision was reached by the presidency after weighing several options, and we thought this latest compromise will preserve the unity of the country and move the people of South Sudan out of this imposed, senseless conflict, which has affected the livelihoods of many of our citizens.
Hundreds of people have protested in the German city of Munich against the ideals of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The protest took place on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, an annual gathering of world leaders to discuss security challenges. The protesters condemned the conference, describing it as a meeting of people obsessed with war and arms dealers.
I want to demonstrate against the NATO Security Conference, and especially against this political tendency to spend more and more money on military security, instead of investing in social areas like healthcare and education.
And it's already Carnival in several countries in Latin America. In Uruguay, thousands are taking part in the longest carnival in the world. So let's take a look.
It's one of the most anticipated parades for all Uruguayans. Each February, tens of thousands of people participate in the parade, where 50 groups of revelers present the colorful and distinct sound of 3 drums, which identify the rhythm of candombe.
Candombe for Uruguay is almost everything. It's a popular movement where the black race is manifested, mixed with the white race and with the tourists. It means a lot for Uruguay. It's typical and the only place in the world where you are going to see it.
This year, the parade was organized as a tribute to Julio Sosa Canela, who died in December last year. He was one of the most famous figures of this carnival.
It's a tribute to Canela, a person who many years ago lived for candombe. He is a reference for all of us that has presented year after year. Unfortunately, he died recently, but today the celebration goes to that great man, a personality for our culture.
Candombe is recognized as an intangible world heritage by UNESCO. The rhythms are an inherited tradition rooted in the slavery era. The Africans brought as slaves passed on the knowledge and values of their rich culture, and in that process created the characteristic drums of candombe.
Today is like the Mecca for all candombe players. It is the day when, after revelers prepare and rehearse weekly, they come together in this tradition. You will see and participate in a group of 70 revelers from the whole country. This is a national contest, and candombe today is how Uruguayans are many times recognized. Where there is an Uruguayan, there is candombe.
Until a few years ago, and before the increase in the amount of revelers looking to compete for the prize of best presentation, the official parade had been organized for 2 days. More than 2,000 drums and dozens of dancers walked along the Isla de las Flores street, the main street of the South and Palermo neighborhoods, to enjoy the carnival with candombe in their hearts.
So we leave you with a presentation by La Gran Muñeca during Uruguay's Carnival, with a song that speaks of the repression under Presidents Macri in Argentina and Piñera in Chile, racism under President Bolsonaro in Brazil, the coup in Bolivia, and how poverty is growing in most countries under right-wing governments. So until next time, enjoy it.
Llegamos al carnaval para defender la tierra. Llegamos al carnaval, hoy América despierta. Pueblos originarios que se juntaron para luchar contra los dictadores evangelistas de Donald Trump. Este es nuestro lugar y tenemos que cuidarlo. Nadie nos podrá callar. Suena fuerte nuestro canto. Somos la patria grande y ahora nadie nos va a parar. Entre todas y todos el continente resistirá. Macri ya no está más, que la gente no se olvide, que le gusta reprimir, igual que Piñera en Chile. Afuera Bolsonaro con su racismo que nos asusta.
Fuera la vieja cheta que está en Bolivia y se cree rubia.
Ecuador está muy mal, paga el pobre, gana el rico. Colombia se despertó, en Perú mandan milicos. Vemos que la derecha vino por